Isaiah's story is an epic confrontation between divine holiness and human corruption that reverberates through millennia. In a world where political power corrupts and spiritual complacency reigns, Isaiah's life confronts us with uncomfortable truths about prophetic calling and the cost of speaking truth. Have you ever wondered how God prepares a voice to speak judgment to kings and hope to the hopeless? Get ready for a narrative that will challenge your notions of divine commissioning and prophetic endurance as we explore the making of the most influential prophet of the ancient world. Isaiah 6 verse 1 introduces us to a nation in crisis. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. In ancient Judah, the death of a king meant more than political transition. It signaled vulnerability, uncertainty, and the exposure of a nation's spiritual bankruptcy. For 52 years, Uzziah had reigned with prosperity and power, but his final days were marked by leprosy and divine judgment. Imagine the terror that must have gripped Jerusalem, a throne left empty, enemies circling like wolves, and a people who had grown comfortable in their corruption. Into this moment of national desperation, God was preparing a messenger who would shake the foundations of power. But God's answer to Judah's crisis didn't come without complications. Isaiah 6 verses 2-4 reveals the overwhelming vision. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, the whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices the doorposts and thresholds shook and the temple was filled with smoke. This wasn't a gentle calling or a peaceful commissioning. The young aristocrat, possibly of royal blood himself, stood face to face with the terrifying holiness of the Almighty. The temple foundations trembled. The air became thick with divine smoke. The seraphim, beings of pure fire, cried out with voices that shattered human comprehension. This vision was a foreshadowing of the confrontation that would mark not only Isaiah's ministry but the destiny of an entire nation. The divine revelation overturned the natural order of things. A comfortable young nobleman would become the voice of uncomfortable truth. Isaiah 6 verses 5-8 narrates the dramatic transformation. Woe to me! Isaiah cried, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to him with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched Isaiah's mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah said, Here am I, send me. The contrast between the unprepared man and the prepared prophet was forged in fire. Isaiah, confronted by absolute holiness, recognized his own corruption and that of his people. The burning coal, an instrument of purification through pain, transformed his lips from instruments of sin to vessels of divine truth. This dramatic moment foreshadowed the burning nature of his message, judgment that would scorch the comfortable and hope that would ignite the faithful. As Isaiah's ministry began, the nature of his calling became clear. Isaiah 6 verses 9-10 contains the shocking commission, Go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding, be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull and close their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Isaiah became a prophet whose message would harden hearts even as it offered salvation, a man whose words would be rejected by the very people he was called to save. He would confront King Ahaz's cowardice, expose Judah's alliances with pagan powers, and stand alone against the religious establishment. His ministry embodied the divine paradox, speaking truth to those who would not hear, offering hope to those who had despised it. The turning point in Isaiah's early ministry came with a confrontation that had eternal consequences. Isaiah 7 verses 10 to 14 recounts the moment King Ahaz, paralyzed by fear as enemy armies gathered against Jerusalem, refused to ask God for a sign of deliverance. His false piety masked his lack of faith. He had already decided to trust in political alliances rather than divine promises. Isaiah, speaking with the authority of heaven, declared, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." This episode reveals much about the character of the prophet. Isaiah, unwavering in his divine commission, confronted royal cowardice with supernatural promise. He saw beyond the immediate crisis to a coming Messiah, a child whose very name, God with us, would answer the deepest cry of humanity. While Ahaz grasped at military solutions, Isaiah pointed to divine intervention. The king wanted political security, the prophet offered messianic hope. The implications of this moment were profound. The sign of Emmanuel was not merely a prediction of immediate deliverance, it carried the weight of eternity. Isaiah's vision reached beyond the Assyrian threat, beyond the destruction of Jerusalem, beyond even the Babylonian exile that would come generations later. He spoke of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of many, a righteous king who would reign in justice, and a restoration so complete that the wolf would lie down with the lamb. For Isaiah, receiving the prophetic mantle was only the first step in a ministry that would span over 40 years and 5 kings. Though his methods were uncompromising and his message often rejected, his determination to speak God's truth would be a recurring theme in his life. He would walk naked as a living prophecy, confront the arrogance of Sennacherib's army, and witness the miraculous destruction of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. This episode sets the stage for the unfolding drama of Isaiah's life. His courage and prophetic clarity would lead him to influence kings and nations, but also place him in situations of persecution and mortal danger. Tradition holds that Isaiah was eventually martyred, sawn in two during the reign of the wicked King Manasseh, a final testimony to the cost of prophetic faithfulness. Isaiah's story reminds us that God can use consecrated vessels to speak truth that transcends generations. His prophecies, forged in the fire of personal encounter with holiness, continue to echo through millennia, proving that a prophet who sees God clearly can speak with clarity to every age that follows. The temple chamber filled with smoke so thick Isaiah could taste it, acrid, holy, suffocating. His knees buckled as the seraphim's voices continued their relentless cry, "Holy, holy, holy." Each proclamation struck him like a physical blow, driving him lower until his face pressed against the cold stone floor. This was not the gentle God of comfortable prayers and ritualistic offerings. This was the Almighty in his raw, terrifying majesty, and Isaiah understood with devastating clarity that he had no right to stand in such presence. "Woe to me!" The words tore from his throat unbidden, a confession ripped from the deepest part of his soul. "I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." Every word he had ever spoken, every compromise, every half-truth, every comfortable silence in the face of injustice, now burned in his memory like acid. He had thought himself righteous, a young man of noble birth with proper pedigree and respectable religion. Now, confronted by absolute holiness, he saw himself as he truly was, corrupt, contaminated, condemned. The aristocratic facade shattered completely. The political connections meant nothing. The family lineage offered no protection. Before the throne of the Almighty, Isaiah was simply another sinner in a nation drowning in sin. And he had seen the King, the true King, with eyes that should have been struck blind. Then came movement that made his blood freeze. One of the seraphim descended, its 6 wings creating currents of heat that washed over Isaiah's prostrate form. In the creature's hand, if such appendages could be called hands, gleamed a coal pulled directly from the altar, white-hot and pulsing with divine fire. Isaiah wanted to scream, to flee, to protest this approaching agony. But his body would not obey. He could only watch, paralyzed by terror and strange expectation, as the burning coal drew closer to his face. The seraph's touch was precise, deliberate, merciless. The coal pressed against Isaiah's lips, those same lips that had just confessed their uncleanness, and the pain was beyond anything his privileged life had prepared him for. The searing heat didn't merely burn the surface, it penetrated deep, cauterizing something essential within him. He tasted copper and ash. Tears streamed down his face, evaporating in the heat before they could fall. Every nerve screamed in protest. Yet within the agony came something else, purification. The seraph's voice cut through Isaiah's torment. "See, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." The coal was not destroying him but remaking him. The fire that should have consumed instead consecrated. His lips, instruments of human compromise, were becoming vessels for divine truth. Then, cutting through the smoke and pain and overwhelming presence, came the voice Isaiah would never forget, would never be able to forget. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Isaiah lifted his face from the stone floor. His lips still burned. His body trembled. His entire understanding of reality had been shattered and reconstituted in these terrible moments. He knew what this commission would cost. He had seen the holiness that demanded everything. Yet from somewhere beyond reason or self-preservation, the answer rose from his purified lips. "Here am I, send me." The prophet was born. The coal had done its work. The war council chamber reeked of fear disguised as strategy. King Ahaz paced before his advisers, his face pale despite the torchlight, his fingers trembling as they traced potential invasion routes on the map spread across the table. To the north, Syria and Israel had formed an unholy alliance, their combined armies already marching toward Jerusalem. The reports grew more dire with each passing hour, villages burned, refugees flooding the city gates, enemy forces drawing closer like a noose tightening around a condemned man's neck. Isaiah watched the young king with something between pity and contempt. Ahaz wore the crown of David, sat on the throne of Solomon, bore the weight of God's covenant promises, yet his eyes darted like a cornered animal seeking any escape route except the one that required faith. The prophet had seen this pattern before in the handful of years since his temple vision, rulers who invoked God's name in public while privately calculating which foreign power offered the best terms of alliance. "Your Majesty," Isaiah's voice cut through the anxious murmuring of advisers. "The Lord has sent me with a word." Ahaz's hand froze over the map. His advisers stepped back, creating a corridor between prophet and king. Everyone in Jerusalem knew of Isaiah, the aristocrat turned oracle, the man who spoke with unnerving authority and refused to soften his messages for political convenience. Some called him a patriot. Others whispered he was dangerous. "Ask the Lord your God for a sign," Isaiah declared, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." The challenge hung in the air like a blade. God himself was offering proof, validation, tangible evidence that would shatter every doubt and excuse. But Ahaz had already made his choice. His response came wrapped in false piety: "I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test." The words were theologically correct, spiritually hollow. Behind them lay the truth. Ahaz had already dispatched envoys to Assyria, had already raided the temple treasury to purchase military intervention from Tiglath-Pileser, had already placed his faith in chariots and treaties rather than the God of his fathers. Isaiah's eyes blazed. "Hear now, O house of David! Is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God as well?" The rebuke struck like thunder in the chamber. Advisers flinched. Ahaz's face flushed with anger and shame. But Isaiah pressed forward, his voice rising with prophetic intensity. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign: the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel, God with us." The words defied natural law, transcended political calculation, reached beyond the immediate crisis into eternity itself. A virgin birth. A divine child. A name that was both promise and indictment: God with us, but who among us truly wanted him? Ahaz sought security through Assyrian steel, God offered salvation through supernatural seed. The king's response was silence, the silence of unbelief, of rejected grace, of opportunities squandered. He would have his Assyrian alliance. Isaiah would have his impossible prophecy. And in the distance, barely audible, the enemy armies continued their march. But the prophet had learned this much from his coal-purified lips: truth didn't require acceptance to remain true. Emmanuel would come, whether Ahaz believed or not. The Egyptian envoys arrived in Jerusalem like merchants peddling salvation, their procession deliberately ostentatious, gilded chariots catching the sunlight, horses bred for war stamping impatiently on the cobblestones, servants carrying gifts that spoke of wealth and military might. They came offering what desperate kingdoms always craved: security through alliance, protection through pagan partnership, deliverance through any means except dependence on the divine. Isaiah stood at the city gate watching the spectacle, his weathered face set in grim recognition. The years since Ahaz's reign had taught him this pattern intimately. Kings changed, crises evolved, but the fundamental faithlessness remained constant. Now under King Hezekiah, a man who at least professed righteousness, the same temptation had returned wearing Egyptian cosmetics. The Assyrian Empire continued its westward expansion, swallowing nations like a lion devouring prey, and Judah's counselors whispered seductively of political solutions to spiritual problems. The prophet had already delivered God's warning multiple times, but the royal court seemed determined to learn through catastrophe rather than through wisdom. So Isaiah watched as Jerusalem's nobility rushed to greet the Egyptian delegation, their faces bright with relief, their voices animated with strategic possibilities. They saw chariots and cavalry. Isaiah saw broken reeds that would pierce the hand of anyone leaning on them. That evening, he appeared unbidden in the palace courtyard where Hezekiah's advisers celebrated their diplomatic breakthrough. But Isaiah brought no congratulations, only the word that burned perpetually in his purified mouth. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help! His voice silenced the festivities like a sword cutting through silk. Who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots and in the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel, or seek help from the Lord. The word struck with prophetic precision, exposing the calculus of faithlessness that motivated every negotiation, every secret treaty, every diplomatic overture to powers who knew nothing of covenant promises. The chief advisor stepped forward, his tone measured but defensive. "Prophet, we face annihilation. Assyria has crushed every nation in its path. Egypt offers military strength. Egypt is a splinter that will break under pressure." Isaiah's interruption was fierce, uncompromising. The Egyptians are men and not God, their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, those who help will stumble, those who are helped will fall, both will perish together. He turned his gaze to Hezekiah, who watched from the shadows with conflicted eyes. You fortify your walls, stockpile weapons, secure water supplies, and negotiate alliances, all while forgetting the one who holds the breath of Assyria's king in his hand. Do you not understand? Egypt cannot save you. Assyria cannot ultimately destroy you. This battle belongs to the Lord, but you insist on fighting it with broken tools. The advisors exchanged glances, some angry, some uncertain, all uncomfortable. They wanted a prophet who would bless their plans, sanctify their strategies, provide divine endorsement for human schemes. Instead, they had Isaiah, who continued to point beyond politics to the singular reality they found most difficult to trust: God's sufficiency. Trust in chariots if you choose, Isaiah concluded, his voice dropping to something almost sorrowful. But when Egyptian promises crumble and Assyrian armies surround these walls, remember whose help you rejected. The celebration did not resume after he left. The burden came to Isaiah in waves, each vision more devastating than the last. Night after night, he woke drenched in sweat, his mind reeling from images of cities burning, kingdoms collapsing, nations drinking the cup of divine judgment. These were not merely political predictions or educated forecasts, they were revelations that carved themselves into his consciousness with searing clarity. God was showing him the fate of the surrounding nations, and the weight of that knowledge threatened to crush him. The first vision struck with particular force. Babylon, that ancient seat of pride and power, whose ziggurats pierced the heavens in defiant grandeur, would become a wasteland. Isaiah saw the mighty city reduced to rubble, inhabited by jackals and owls, her proud towers crumbling into dust. Babylon has fallen, has fallen. The words tore from his throat in the darkness, though the city still stood in all its glory, though her fall seemed impossible to anyone calculating by human measures. Yet Isaiah knew with prophetic certainty the golden kingdom would taste the bitterness of divine retribution for her arrogance. Then came Moab, Judah's contentious neighbor, a people bound by ancient kinship yet separated by perpetual conflict. The vision of Moab's devastation struck Isaiah differently. There was sorrow mixed with the judgment, grief intertwined with prophecy. He saw refugees fleeing through the night, their wealth carried on the backs of donkeys, their cities destroyed within 3 years. My heart cries out for Moab, Isaiah declared to the empty streets of Jerusalem, and meant it. Even in pronouncing doom, the prophet's purified lips tasted the tragedy of nations rejecting their Maker. Damascus, that ancient city of commerce and military might, would cease to be a city at all. Isaiah watched in his vision as her fortified walls fell, her strategic position crumbled, her people scattered like chaff before the wind. Syria's pride, her alliance with Israel against Judah, would be her undoing. Within a generation, the kingdom that now threatened Jerusalem would become a memory, a cautionary tale whispered by survivors. The oracle against Ethiopia and Egypt carried particular irony given Judah's constant temptation to seek alliance with these powers. Isaiah saw the Nile fail, Egyptian wisdom turn to foolishness, their princes become fools, their counselors give senseless advice. The nation that marketed itself as the ancient keeper of knowledge would be reduced to confusion and chaos. Those who trusted in Egyptian strength would find themselves leaning on a staff that pierced their hand. The visions continued relentlessly. Edom's judgment for perpetual hatred. Arabia's caravans disrupted, her trading routes destroyed within a year. Each nation, each kingdom, each proud civilization that had established itself without reference to the Holy One of Israel, all would face divine reckoning. Isaiah carried these burdens like stones in his chest. He proclaimed them publicly in the marketplace, in the temple courts, wherever people gathered, knowing most would dismiss him as a madman or traitor. Foreign diplomats mocked him. Judah's nobles accused him of undermining national security. Even common citizens turned away when they saw him approaching, unwilling to hear more pronouncements of doom. Yet the words had to be spoken. Judgment was coming not merely to discipline but to demonstrate a truth the nations refused to acknowledge: there is one God, and every kingdom that forgets him will ultimately fall. The prophet had become the herald of inevitable devastation, the voice crying out warnings no one wanted to hear, bearing the weight of divine knowledge that offered no comfort except this: God's word, whether received or rejected, would accomplish its purpose. The command came with such shocking clarity that Isaiah initially wondered if he had misheard the voice that had never failed him. Remove the sackcloth from your body and take off your sandals. Not a metaphorical instruction. Not a vision to be described. An actual, physical demonstration that would strip away every vestige of dignity, social standing, and prophetic respectability he possessed. Isaiah stood in his modest dwelling, the weight of the divine directive settling over him like a death sentence. 3 years. God required 3 years of walking through Jerusalem's streets without clothing, without sandals, exposed to scorching sun and freezing nights, visible to every eye and subject to every insult. This was not prophecy spoken from a safe distance, this was prophecy embodied, prophecy that would transform his own body into a living scroll of judgment. He removed his garments slowly, each layer peeled away feeling like skin being flayed. The sackcloth fell to the floor. The sandals lay abandoned. Isaiah stood naked before his God, and understood with devastating clarity what was being asked. Egypt and Ethiopia, those nations Judah continued courting despite repeated warnings, would be led away as captives, stripped and barefoot, their nakedness exposed, their shame visible to all who had trusted in their power. And Isaiah would become the walking embodiment of that coming humiliation. The first day was the hardest. Stepping into Jerusalem's streets without clothing felt like stepping into fire all over again, different from the temple coal but equally purifying, equally agonizing. Merchants stopped mid-transaction to stare. Children pointed and laughed before their mothers hurried them away. Religious leaders gathered in clusters, their faces twisted in disgust and righteous indignation. "The prophet has lost his mind," they whispered, loud enough for Isaiah to hear. God would never command such obscenity. But Isaiah walked on, his bare feet collecting dust and thorns, his exposed skin burning under the sun's merciless gaze. He moved through the marketplace where he had once commanded respect, past the temple steps where he had delivered oracles, along the walls where guards now looked away in embarrassment or contempt. Every step declared the message his mouth had spoken for years: your Egyptian alliance is shame disguised as strategy, your Ethiopian treaties are nakedness masquerading as protection. The weeks turned to months. Seasons changed. Isaiah's body became weathered, scarred, a testament to prophetic obedience that demanded everything. People threw refuse at him. Former friends crossed the street to avoid contact. He became Jerusalem's living scandal, the mad prophet whose very presence accused the comfortable of their faithlessness. Yet through it all, Isaiah continued. When winter rains lashed his unprotected flesh, he walked. When summer heat threatened to break him, he persisted. When mockery and stones pelted him in equal measure, he endured. His nakedness became more eloquent than any sermon, his suffering more convicting than any condemnation. 3 years. 1,000 days of prophetic witness purchased at the price of personal dignity. And when the time finally ended, when Isaiah could again cover his scarred body, the message remained indelible in Jerusalem's memory: God's prophets do not merely speak truth, sometimes they must become it, regardless of the cost. Egypt and Ethiopia would fall exactly as his body had proclaimed, and those who trusted in them would share in their shame. For the first time in decades, Isaiah entered the palace without the familiar weight of condemnation pressing against his chest. King Ahaz was dead, that faithless ruler who had chosen Assyrian steel over divine promises, who had desecrated the temple and sacrificed his own son to pagan gods. Now his son Hezekiah sat on David's throne, and the change was palpable, extraordinary, almost miraculous. The young king rose when Isaiah entered, a gesture of respect no monarch had shown the prophet in living memory. Hezekiah's eyes carried something Ahaz never had: genuine hunger for righteousness, authentic desire to know God's will rather than merely use God's name for political cover. He was 25 years old, raised in a palace of corruption, yet somehow untainted by his father's apostasy. "The high places," Hezekiah said without preamble, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm tearing them down. All of them. The Asherah poles, the bronze serpent Moses made that has become an object of worship, the altars on every hill, gone. Judah will worship the Lord alone, in the temple alone, according to the law alone." Isaiah studied the king's face, searching for political calculation, for the subtle compromises that always seem to creep into royal declarations of faith. He found none. This was not performative piety. Hezekiah meant every word, and was already implementing reforms that would have gotten any previous king assassinated by his own priests. "Your father made Judah a wasteland of false worship," Isaiah responded carefully, his prophet's instinct still cautious despite the hope stirring in his chest. "The people have grown comfortable with their idols, their syncretism, their half-hearted devotion. They will resist these changes. Let them resist." Hezekiah's jaw set with determination. "I've read the covenant. I've seen what God requires. My father's path led to tribute payments, vassal status, and spiritual bankruptcy. I will not continue his legacy." He paused, then added with striking vulnerability, "But I need wisdom. I need counsel from someone who speaks God's truth regardless of royal preference." For 4 decades, Isaiah had stood before kings offering words they rejected. He had watched Uzziah's pride lead to leprosy, Ahaz's faithlessness invite foreign domination, and Judah spiral deeper into corruption despite his warnings. Now, impossibly, a king was actually asking for divine guidance with every intention of obeying it. "Then hear the word of the Lord," Isaiah began, his voice softening with something approaching tenderness. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding or the counsel of those who calculate by earthly wisdom. The reforms you're implementing, continue them without compromise. Reopen the temple. Restore the priesthood. Celebrate Passover as it has not been celebrated since Solomon's day." Over the following months, Isaiah watched Hezekiah transform Judah with an intensity that bordered on revolutionary. The king personally supervised the destruction of idolatrous altars. He summoned Levites from their scattered villages and restored proper temple worship. He invited even the northern tribes, those remnants of Israel still surviving under Assyrian occupation, to come to Jerusalem for Passover. It was not perfect. Opposition remained fierce. The surrounding nations viewed Judah's religious reforms as political weakness. And on the horizon, barely visible but growing steadily closer, the Assyrian Empire continued its inexorable march. But for the first time since his temple vision, Isaiah prophesied with hope rather than judgment. Here was a king who listened, who obeyed, who sought God's face rather than political advantage. The prophet's scarred lips, purified by divine fire and weathered by years of rejection, finally spoke words of blessing over a monarch who might actually prove worthy of them. The storm was still coming. But at least this time, Judah would face it with a king who knew where true deliverance was found. The Assyrian army arrived like locusts descending on a harvest field, innumerable, insatiable, unstoppable. From Jerusalem's walls, the defenders could see the enemy camps stretching to the horizon in every direction, siege engines being assembled with methodical precision, supply lines that seemed endless. Sennacherib had already conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah, leaving smoking ruins and impaled corpses in his wake. Now he had come for the prize, Jerusalem itself. Isaiah stood beside King Hezekiah on the wall, watching the Assyrian officer stride forward with the arrogant confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. Behind him, the massed forces of the greatest military machine the world had ever seen waited with patient certainty. This was not a battle. This was an execution delayed only by the formalities of surrender. The Assyrian field commander's voice carried across the distance with calculated loudness, ensuring every defender on the wall could hear. He spoke in Hebrew, a deliberate insult, bypassing diplomatic protocols to address the common soldiers directly. "This is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing this confidence of yours? Do you think mere words substitute for military skill and strength?" Hezekiah's commanders shifted uneasily. The Assyrian was not wrong. Jerusalem's walls were strong, but Lachish had stronger walls and now lay in ruins. The city's water supply was secured, but that only delayed the inevitable. Judah stood alone, her Egyptian allies nowhere to be seen, her fortified cities already fallen. "You say you are depending on the Lord your God," the commander continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "But isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, 'You must worship before this altar in Jerusalem'?" The argument was clever, twisted, portraying Hezekiah's reforms as an offense to the very God he claimed to serve. Then came the escalation, the blasphemy that made Isaiah's blood run cold. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let him persuade you to trust in the Lord, saying the Lord will surely deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand?" The commander paused, letting his words sink in like poison. "Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every nation the Assyrian had mentioned was destroyed, their gods proven impotent, their people scattered or enslaved. The logic seemed irrefutable. Jerusalem's God was simply the next deity to be exposed as powerless before Assyrian might. Isaiah watched Hezekiah's face, saw the king's jaw clench, saw the struggle between faith and visible reality playing out behind his eyes. Around them, soldiers whispered in fear. Some were already calculating surrender terms. The Assyrian commander smiled, knowing his words had found their mark. But Isaiah felt something else rising within him, not fear, but fury. Not despair, but divine indignation. This pagan officer had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had mocked military strength Isaiah could acknowledge. He had questioned political alliances the prophet had himself condemned. But now he had blasphemed the Holy One of Israel, comparing the Creator of heaven and earth to carved idols and impotent demons. The Assyrian had just signed his own death warrant. He simply didn't know it yet. Hezekiah tore his clothes when he heard the full report of the Assyrian mockery, covering himself in sackcloth before stumbling into the temple. His message to Isaiah was desperate, raw with the honesty of a man watching everything he had built collapsing around him. "This day is a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace. It may be that the Lord your God will hear the words of the field commander and will rebuke him for the words he has heard. Pray for the remnant that still survives." Isaiah's response came with the certainty that had marked his ministry from the beginning. "This is what the Lord says, do not be afraid of what you have heard, those words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. I will put a spirit in him so that when he hears a certain report, he will return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword." But Sennacherib was not finished with his psychological warfare. A written message arrived, carried by messengers who spoke with the casual confidence of men representing invincible power. The letter rehearsed the same blasphemies, the same comparisons between the Lord and defeated deities, the same inevitable logic of Assyrian supremacy. Hezekiah read it alone in the temple, then spread it before the altar like evidence in a cosmic courtroom. His prayer was not eloquent or theological. It was the cry of a desperate man who had exhausted every human option. Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Give ear, Lord, and hear, open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to the word Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Isaiah came to Hezekiah that evening with a prophecy that defied everything visible from Jerusalem's walls. The oracle burned on his tongue with divine fire. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came he will return, he will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and save it, for my sake and for the sake of David my servant. The word seemed impossible. The Assyrian army surrounded them completely. Siege preparations were already underway. Every military calculation pointed toward inevitable conquest. Yet Isaiah spoke with absolute conviction, his coal-purified lips declaring a deliverance that existed only in the realm of divine promise. That night, Jerusalem's defenders kept anxious watch from the walls, expecting the assault to begin with dawn. But as darkness deepened, something moved through the Assyrian camps, something invisible, inexorable, terrible beyond comprehension. No battle cries rang out. No alarm trumpet sounded. Only an eerie, spreading silence. When dawn finally broke, the sentries stared in disbelief at what the morning light revealed. The Assyrian camps were still there, the tents, the siege engines, the supply wagons, all exactly where they had been. But the soldiers were dead. All of them. 185,000 warriors struck down in the night without a single sword being drawn, without Jerusalem's defenders lifting a finger in their own defense. The angel of the Lord had passed through the enemy ranks like death's own shadow, executing divine judgment on those who had blasphemed the Holy One. Sennacherib, the mighty king who had conquered nations, found himself commanding an army of corpses. By midday, the few surviving Assyrians were in full retreat, their invincible reputation shattered by a single night of divine intervention. Isaiah stood on Jerusalem's wall, watching the enemy flee, and felt the weight of 4 decades of prophetic ministry crystallize into this moment. Every rejected warning, every mocked prophecy, every persecution endured, all vindicated in one supernatural stroke. The years after Jerusalem's deliverance should have been Isaiah's victory lap, the vindicated prophet finally receiving the honor his faithfulness deserved. Instead, they became something far more profound and painful. The visions that came to him in his final decades transcended everything he had previously seen, reaching beyond Judah's immediate circumstances into mysteries that made even the temple vision seem like a preliminary sketch. Isaiah saw a figure unlike any king or conqueror. Not robed in royal purple or wielding military might, but despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows acquainted with deepest grief. The vision gripped him with such intensity that he wept as he recorded it, his aged hand trembling as he wrote words that defied every messianic expectation his people harbored. This coming deliverer would not arrive with armies to crush Israel's enemies. He would arrive as a suffering servant, oppressed and afflicted, led like a lamb to the slaughter. He was pierced for our transgressions, Isaiah wrote, the words flowing from some source deeper than his own understanding. He was crushed for our iniquities, the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. The prophet who had spent decades pronouncing judgment now glimpsed the ultimate solution to human sin, not through military victory or political reform, but through substitutionary suffering. The vision continued with devastating clarity. This servant would be assigned a grave with the wicked, though he had done no violence nor was any deceit in his mouth. He would be cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of God's people. Yet somehow, impossibly, he would see the light of life after his suffering and be satisfied. Through his knowledge, this righteous servant would justify many, bearing their iniquities as his own burden. Isaiah struggled to reconcile these visions with everything he knew about the promised Messiah. How could David's heir be both suffering servant and conquering king? How could victory come through defeat, exaltation through humiliation, life through death? The paradox threatened to tear his understanding apart, yet the divine revelation persisted with undeniable authority. More visions followed. Isaiah saw this servant's mission extending beyond Israel to become a light for the Gentiles, bringing salvation to the ends of the earth. He witnessed a new heaven and new earth where righteousness dwells, where the wolf would live with the lamb, where sorrow and sighing would flee away. He glimpsed restoration so complete it made Jerusalem's recent deliverance seem like a shadow of the true redemption to come. In his final years, Isaiah became increasingly isolated. Hezekiah's reforms had stalled. The king's son Manasseh was already showing signs of the apostasy that would characterize his reign. The people who had briefly celebrated the Assyrian defeat returned to their comfortable compromises. And Isaiah continued proclaiming visions that reached centuries into the future, speaking of a suffering servant most of his contemporaries found incomprehensible or offensive. Tradition holds that Manasseh eventually ordered Isaiah's execution, the prophet sawn in two for his unyielding testimony. Whether the tradition is accurate or not, Isaiah's final prophecies suggest he knew his message would outlive him by generations. He was not writing for his contemporaries alone but for people yet unborn who would one day witness the servant's arrival and recognize the fulfillment of ancient words. The coal that had purified his lips in the temple had prepared him for more than 4 decades of prophetic ministry. It had prepared him to glimpse the ultimate act of purification, when another would bear the fire of divine judgment so that many could be made clean. Isaiah had proclaimed both doom and deliverance, but his final visions revealed that true redemption would require a suffering far greater than his own, a sacrifice that would echo through eternity. The prophet who had walked naked through Jerusalem, who had confronted kings and survived sieges, who had witnessed miraculous deliverance, spent his final days writing of a greater prophet, a greater suffering, and a greater victory yet to come.
If this story spoke to you, you're welcome to stay. We share Bible stories with a cinematic voice and simple truth. Subscribe to follow the next story. And if this message helped you today, share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.